When exactly did Genesis cross from prog into pop? Of course, most people point straight to 1978's And Then There Were Three, but there's a lot more to it than that. It was actually more of a gradual change. As most of you know, Genesis were giants of the 70s prog rock scene. After their first album in '69, their second effort, Trespass, in 1970, saw them testing the proggy waters, introducing longer song structures and exploring fantasy-themed lyrics. But it was the addition of Phil Collins and Steve Hackett where they really became Genesis. Nursery Crime, fantastic name by the way, saw their sound and style become what would later be known as the classic era. This album leaned heavily into the fantasy themes and also had a darker, more dynamic atmosphere to it. It was barely contained chaos, but for the people who got it, it was masterful. Songs like The Musical Box helped them showcase their creativity. That's a sprawling 10-minute thing. It's got a life of its own. I mean, just listen to the end section. It's absolutely bonkers. Touch me now. But Genesis were away, and they just kept turning it up to 11. In the 70s prog landscape, they had some serious competition, of course. Pink Floyd, yes, King Crimson. But they had what it took to stand out. Next, of course, came Foxtrot in 1972, and this is considered by many to be their peak prog days. Peter Gabriel had perfected his storytelling and bizarre lyrical style, and his onstage theatrics were becoming quite legendary. And if you thought The Musical Box was long, how about 23 minutes? That's how long Supper's Ready is. We climb up the mountain of human flesh. It was a significant milestone for the band.
Supper's Ready was extremely important to the band because, in a way, that was a sort of centerpiece for our ambitions in terms of writing. Because, whatever else was going on in the visual department, our central interest was always, and probably is still, the writing, the composition of the music. And that was the most adventurous piece to date.
For the next few years, Genesis were a creative monster of a band. Nothing was too far out there. Nothing was too experimental. 1973's Selling England by the Pound took Gabriel's songwriting to a new level, with tracks like The Battle of Epping Forest. In 1974, they came out with their rock opera, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. It's been a point of contention among fans for years whether this was less proggy or not. The music was written around the lyrics and narrative, leaving less room for massive, exploratory instrumentals. And most of the tracks were shorter and more focused. There was a little bit less symphony going on and a little bit more story. So it could be said this was an early step away from their most classic prog rock era, but they definitely hadn't gone pop. That was still to come. For Lamb, Peter Gabriel had taken complete control of the lyrics and narrative, which in retrospect doesn't sound like a bad idea because he was a fantastic lyricist. But the band didn't completely appreciate him holding the reins, and probably felt a little confined having to write music for the lyrics. Creative differences started to arise. In fairness, he was wearing stuff like this on stage. But it wasn't just creative differences. Gabriel was starting to spend more and more time on other interests, such as film. He's spoken about the time period as feeling like he was inside a machine, losing himself. There was all this big-time stuff happening, with long tours being planned way in the future, and I just felt I was getting to be part of a machine. I felt I was becoming a sort of stereotype, sort of rock star, or falling into wanting that ego gratification. I didn't like myself. I didn't like the situation, and I didn't feel free. It all came to a head when he had to choose his family. Severe complications during the birth of his first daughter in 1974 meant that he had to take time away from the band setup to support his family, which of course is fair enough. But the band weren't very sympathetic at the time.
We were so unsupportive. We were like young into the album, intense, this is what we're doing, And Pete, poor old Pete, having to, deal with a terribly traumatic birth, and touch and go and dramas, We gave no help at all, actually.
And so, to cut a long story short, he left after touring the album. Now what? I mean, most bands might have quit then. Gabriel was instrumental to their sound, their approach, their live show. How could they possibly carry on without him? Who could replace him? In 1975, they auditioned 400 singers, but it turned out they already had the right person in the band itself. They just didn't know it yet. Of course, it was Phil Collins. The drummer had sung lead vocals for Genesis a couple of times already. So they decided to let Collins handle the vocals permanently. And this was a pivotal moment in their change in sound. Collins' voice and approach was very different to Peter Gabriel's. His was warmer, almost bluesy. And so, with Phil Collins on vocals, and no idea what would happen, they started recording Trick of the Tail. And it worked. They still kept the prog vibes with fantasy themes and long melodic passages. It was ambitious, it was complex, but Collins worked in slightly more accessible lyrics. And it had a lighter atmosphere than the Gabriel era songs. So they hadn't strictly gone pop yet, but the sound had definitely changed. And crucially, the live show looked very different. Gone were Peter Gabriel's outrageous outfits and massive stage persona. That's not to say Collins didn't give it a good go, though.
The first gig was strange because I've been so used to just looking up and seeing Peter there, and I got a certain confidence of seeing Peter.
You had to look down then, didn't you?
Yes, I feel like I was looking down, you're right. And it just seemed so funny. And it also, you just didn't know really how the audience were going to react because you thought that they were going to miss him and everything. Miss Peter, I mean. And it was very strange. About halfway through the show, I suddenly realised this was going to work. I mean, he had his own approach to the audience, but they sort of seemed to like him, which was curious,
Wind and Wuthering was a similar affair. Still prog Genesis, but Collins' version of that. But then the next key change came. Guitarist Steve Hackett left. He was frustrated that a lot of his material was being left out of songs or buried in the mix, and there was also tension between his growing solo career and his bandmates. Disappointed, the remaining members carried on, with Mike Rutherford swapping from bass to guitar. And this brings us to the magic moment. And then there were three. Rutherford's guitar approach was a bit more simplistic. It wasn't that he wasn't any good at the guitar, obviously, but he just wasn't the virtuosic, classically trained Steve Hackett. There was no more layered two-guitar setup. Instead, it was now tighter, it was more focused, more streamlined, and maybe unintentionally at first, more accessible. There are still the old prog fingerprints here and there. Burning Rope, for instance, has echoes of the old Genesis, but the sound is definitely shifting. The songs are shorter, with tighter structures and cleaner production. The longest track on this album is 7 minutes. Still long for a pop song, but certainly not a 23-minute epic. Almost infamously now, it had Follow You, Follow Me, the first proper Genesis hit. It was a simple, heartfelt love song. No weird time signatures, just melody, emotion, simplicity. Of course, some older fans hated it, but it worked. It charted well, and helped bring them to a wider audience. And it made something very clear. Genesis could write pop songs, and people would actually listen. Let's compare that song to, the Battle of Epping Forest. Yeah, bit of a change, right? By the time Duke dropped in 1980, the change was in full swing. The album is a fascinating hybrid. On one hand, there's still room for the band's storytelling. Duke's Travels and Duke's End kind of nod back to the long-form style of their prog days, and there's a bit of the old weird keyboard sounds in there as well. But then you get tracks like Misunderstanding and Turn It On Again. They're more punchy, catchy, and modern. It's like pop, but with a prog brain. And it wasn't just the sound that was changing, it was the image as well. Phil Collins was now much more comfortable as a frontman. He was front and centre, charismatic and approachable, almost the opposite of Gabriel. The band went from feeling like a theatre troupe to a powerful, arena-ready trio. And then of course, there was Abacab. This one pushed the transformation even further. The title track is jagged and experimental, but tracks like No Reply at All leaned hard into pop-funk territory.
There's no reply at all.
Suffice to say, we're now a long way from Supper's Ready. And then there was Genesis, the self-titled album from 1983. The sound was contemporary and made for radio. They'd shaken off the prog trying to go pop label. They were just a massive band now, writing huge songs. Still weird, still clever, but very much mainstream. Then came Invisible Touch in 1986. This was Genesis at their commercial peak. It had 5 top 5 singles on it. That made history. By now they were in full-blown pop stardom. Stadiums. They were all over MTV. It was smooth, big-sounding and unapologetically modern. And yes, for some long-time fans, it was all too much. The fantasy landscapes and 10-minute stories were a thing of the past. But I don't think it's fair to say they sold out. They evolved. They adapted. They proved they could be a chart-topping band without losing their identity entirely. Although a lot of you might argue with me on that last point, and you know where the comment section is. So, from And Then There Were Three to Invisible Touch, Genesis pulled off something incredible and unlikely. They morphed from a cult prog band into global pop icons. However, there was one song in their catalogue that they ended up refusing to play live. Bit of a strange story, actually. You can click over there for that one.